They thought they were ending a simple rebellion. To them, Jesus was just another troublemaker, another voice stirring the people. But what happened to those who played a role in his crucifixion? Were their fates just, or did they suffer consequences far beyond what they could have imagined? History has preserved chilling accounts of what befell the men responsible for condemning and executing Christ. Could it be mere coincidence that so many of them met violent, tragic ends? Or was there something more, something beyond human comprehension at play? The crucifixion of Jesus was not the act of one person alone. It was a chain of decisions made by rulers, soldiers, and religious leaders, each playing a part in his death. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, had the power to free Jesus, yet he washed his hands of the matter, delivering him to the crowd. The chief priests, driven by envy and fear, demanded his execution. The Roman soldiers mocked, tortured, and nailed him to the cross, showing no mercy. Each of them, whether by direct action or silent consent, had blood on their hands. Before we continue, I have a special request for you. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support makes all the difference. If you love learning about the history of Jesus, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with others who would enjoy this content. Let's spread these powerful stories together. But what became of them after that fateful day? Their power and authority had given them the ability to take a life, yet history tells us they could not escape their own. Their deaths were not peaceful, nor were they the ends they had envisioned for themselves. One by one, they met gruesome fates, suffering in ways eerily fitting to their roles in Jesus' execution. Pontius Pilate, the man who declared, "I am innocent of this man's blood," would find himself drowning in guilt. His political career spiraled into disgrace, and he was recalled to Rome, where some say he ended his own life in despair. Others claim he was executed. Either way, the governor who sought to avoid responsibility could not outrun the weight of his decision. Then there were the high priests, Caiaphas and Annas, who had conspired to bring false charges against Jesus. Their hunger for control led them to manipulate the legal system against an innocent man. Yet within a few years, they were removed from power, shamed, and, according to some accounts, met violent deaths. Their legacy, corruption, and downfall. And what of the Roman soldiers? The men who struck Jesus, placed the crown of thorns on his head, and gambled for his clothing. Many of them vanished from historical records, but legends and early Christian writings tell of their misfortunes. Some were said to have gone mad, haunted by what they had done. Others perished in battle, meeting their end as brutally as they had once treated Jesus. But this is only the beginning. Their stories of suffering and destruction stretch far beyond what most imagine. In the next part, we will uncover the harrowing details of how each of these figures met their end, and whether justice was truly served. The events of that fateful day at Golgotha did not end with the crucifixion. The men who condemned and executed Jesus believed they had silenced him forever. But history tells a different story, one in which their own lives unraveled in ways they never expected. One by one, they faced terrifying fates, as if divine justice had reached out to claim them. Let's begin with Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who had the authority to release Jesus, but chose to bow to political pressure instead. When he washed his hands in front of the crowd, declaring himself innocent, he may have convinced himself that he had avoided guilt. But could he truly escape the consequences? Shortly after the crucifixion, Pilate's rule in Judea crumbled. His brutal tactics led to complaints that reached Emperor Caligula, who stripped him of his position. Some historical accounts suggest that Pilate was sent into exile, where he was overcome with despair. It is said that he took his own life, unable to bear the weight of his actions. Other sources claim he was executed under orders from Rome. Either way, the man who sought to absolve himself of Jesus' blood met a fate as tragic as the one he had allowed. Then there was Caiaphas, the high priest who had orchestrated Jesus' trial and handed him over to Pilate. Caiaphas, along with his father-in-law Annas, had conspired against Jesus, using their influence to manipulate the people and ensure his execution. But their power did not last. Just a few years later, Caiaphas was deposed from his position and thrown into disgrace. Some accounts say he ended his days in shame, abandoned by the very system he had once controlled. Others suggest he died by his own hand, tormented by guilt, much like Judas before him. And what of Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver? Though not one of the executioners, Judas played a direct role in delivering Christ to his enemies. But his regret came swiftly. After realizing the horror of his betrayal, he tried to return the silver, crying, "I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood." The priests coldly dismissed him, and in his despair, Judas went out and hanged himself. His story did not end there. Acts 1:18 describes a gruesome death, saying he fell headlong, his body bursting open. The man who sold his master for money did not live long enough to spend his ill-gotten gains. These three, Pilate, Caiaphas, and Judas, each had different roles in Jesus' execution, but all met similar ends: disgrace, despair, and violent death. Yet they were not the only ones who suffered. Many more, including the Roman soldiers who mocked and tortured Jesus, would face their own terrifying fates. In the next part, we will explore what happened to the very men who nailed Christ to the cross and cast lots for his garments, unaware that they were sealing their own destinies. The men who physically carried out the crucifixion of Jesus, the Roman soldiers, believed they were merely following orders. To them, he was just another criminal, another execution among many. But what happened to them after that day? Did they go on with their lives as if nothing had happened, or did they meet their own tragic ends? History and early accounts reveal chilling details about the fate of those who mocked, tortured, and nailed Jesus to the cross. Among these soldiers were those who scourged him, drove the nails into his hands and feet, and cast lots for his clothing. Their cruelty knew no bounds as they placed a crown of thorns on his head, struck him, and ridiculed him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," Matthew 27:29. But as Jesus took his final breath, strange and terrifying events unfolded. The sky darkened, the earth quaked, and the temple veil was torn in two. These signs sent a wave of fear through those present, including one centurion who cried out, "Truly, this was the Son of God," Matthew 27:54. For some of these soldiers, the realization of what they had done came too late. The very men who had laughed at Jesus' suffering soon found themselves suffering in ways they could never have foreseen. Early Christian writings and historical accounts suggest that many of them met violent and untimely deaths. Some were said to have perished in battle, their bodies mutilated in ways eerily reminiscent of the wounds they had inflicted on Jesus. Others reportedly fell into madness, haunted by nightmares of the crucifixion. One particularly chilling account speaks of Longinus, the Roman centurion who pierced Jesus' side with a spear. According to tradition, he later converted to Christianity after witnessing the miraculous events surrounding the crucifixion. But his transformation came at a cost. He was eventually hunted down and executed for his newfound faith. The very man who had once participated in Christ's suffering would himself be put to death for proclaiming his name. Other soldiers were not as fortunate as Longinus in finding redemption. Some historical records suggest that the guards assigned to Jesus' tomb, the same ones who witnessed the resurrection, were bribed by the chief priests to spread the false story that Jesus' disciples had stolen his body, Matthew 28:12-15. But their deception did not protect them for long. Roman military discipline was ruthless, and failing in one's duty, especially in guarding a tomb, was punishable by death. It is believed that these soldiers were executed for their supposed failure, silenced to prevent the truth from spreading. The irony is undeniable. The men who had power over Jesus' body on the day of his death ultimately lost control over their own fates. Their stories serve as a warning that no act of cruelty goes unnoticed, and justice, divine or otherwise, always finds its way. The execution of Jesus Christ was not solely the work of Roman authorities. Among those responsible were the powerful religious and political figures of the time, men who held influence over Judea and who saw Jesus as a threat to their control. Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, and the high priests who plotted against Jesus believed they had succeeded in silencing him, but their own lives took dark and horrific turns, leading them to deaths just as tragic and humiliating as the one they had orchestrated for Christ. One of the most infamous figures in this story is Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee. This was the same Herod who had ordered the beheading of John the Baptist and later played a role in Jesus' fate. When Jesus was brought before him, Herod treated him with scorn, mocking him and demanding to see a miracle. But Jesus remained silent, refusing to entertain the king's arrogance. Luke 23:9. Enraged, Herod dressed Jesus in an elegant robe as a form of mockery and sent him back to Pilate to be condemned. Herod's cruelty did not go unanswered. Soon after Jesus' death, his fortunes crumbled. His political ambitions led him to beg Emperor Caligula for more power. But instead of granting his request, Caligula banished him to exile in Gaul, modern-day France. Stripped of his wealth, status, and power, Herod died in disgrace, far from the kingdom he once ruled. According to some accounts, he perished in deep misery, tormented by the ghosts of his past crimes, including his role in Jesus' condemnation. But Herod was not the only religious leader to meet a grim fate. Annas and Caiaphas, the high priests who had conspired against Jesus, also saw their power fade. Annas, the elder statesman of the priesthood, had long wielded influence over Jewish religious affairs, even after being officially removed from office. His son-in-law Caiaphas, the acting high priest at the time of Jesus' trial, played a direct role in his condemnation, declaring that it was better for one man to die than for the whole nation to perish. John 11:50. Shortly after Jesus' resurrection, both men lost everything. Caiaphas was deposed from his position a few years later, stripped of the authority he had so ruthlessly exercised. Some traditions suggest he committed suicide, unable to live with the guilt of his actions. Others claim he was assassinated or executed by Roman authorities as instability grew in Judea. Annas, too, met a violent end. According to some historical sources, he was later murdered in an uprising against the Jewish leadership. These once powerful men, who had dictated the fate of Jesus, saw their own lives crumble into disgrace and death. But the retribution did not stop there. More names remain on the list of those who played a role in the execution of Christ, and their fates are equally disturbing. The execution of Jesus Christ was not just an act of cruelty, it was a spectacle. As he hung on the cross, the crowd gathered, some mourning, but many mocking. The soldiers laughed, the religious leaders sneered, and passers-by hurled insults. They challenged him, saying, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Matthew 27:40. Yet, in the face of their hatred, Jesus responded with mercy, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. Among those who ridiculed Jesus were members of the Sanhedrin, Roman soldiers, and bystanders who had once welcomed him into Jerusalem with palm branches, but now celebrated his suffering. They treated his agony as entertainment, oblivious to the judgment that awaited them. Their words, meant to humiliate him, would come back to haunt them in ways they never anticipated. Many of these men met horrifying ends, their lives marked by violence, disgrace, and misery. Several members of the Sanhedrin who had conspired to have Jesus arrested and falsely accused later perished in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., when the Roman legions, led by General Titus, besieged the city. Starvation, disease, and slaughter consumed its inhabitants. The Jewish leaders who had once held positions of power were either massacred or taken captive. Their temple, the center of their authority, was burned to the ground, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy that not one stone will be left on another. Matthew 24:2. The Roman soldiers who mocked Jesus and gambled for his garments also faced dire fates. The empire that had seemed invincible began to crumble in the years following Jesus' death and resurrection. Many of those same soldiers were sent to battle in distant lands, where they met brutal deaths in wars and uprisings. Some historical accounts suggest that soldiers who had participated in Jesus' crucifixion later suffered insanity, disease, or violent deaths. The mocking voices that once filled Golgotha were silenced by their own suffering. Even among the common people who had joined in ridiculing Jesus, there were those who later realized the gravity of their actions. Some were converted after witnessing the resurrection and the signs that followed. Others, however, continued in their ways and perished in disasters that struck the region in the following decades. The earthquakes, famines, and plagues that swept through the Roman world after Jesus' death served as grim reminders that no act of injustice goes unnoticed. The fate of those who mocked Jesus is a sobering lesson. The suffering they inflicted on him was temporary, but the consequences of their actions lasted far beyond their lifetimes. Jesus had offered them forgiveness, but many rejected it, sealing their own fates. Their laughter faded, their scorn turned to silence, and their legacies became warnings rather than triumphs. The deaths of these men were not coincidences. They serve as a reminder that justice, whether divine or historical, eventually comes for those who believe they are beyond its reach. The suffering of Jesus on the cross was unlike any other execution. It was not just a physical torment, but a moment of cosmic significance. Yet, to those who watched, it was nothing more than another criminal's end. Many of those who participated in his trial, torture, and crucifixion went on with their lives, believing that they had succeeded in silencing him. But history records that their fates were anything but peaceful. One of the most notable figures connected to Jesus' execution was Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great and the nephew of Herod Antipas. Although he was not directly involved in sentencing Jesus, he continued the persecution of Christ's followers. He played a role in the imprisonment and execution of early Christians, including James, the brother of John, and sought to destroy the growing movement. But his arrogance led to his downfall. According to Acts 12:21-23, Herod Agrippa met a gruesome death. During a public celebration, he dressed in royal robes, and as the people praised him as a god, he did not reject their worship. At that moment, he was struck down. The Bible says that an angel of the Lord struck him, and he was eaten by worms and died. Historical sources confirm that his death was agonizing. He suffered intense pain in his abdomen for days before succumbing to what many believe was a parasitic infection or internal disease. His end mirrored the arrogance he had displayed as he perished in front of the very people who had once glorified him. Another terrifying fate befell Annas the Younger, the son of the high priest Annas, who had played a role in condemning Jesus. As the years passed, he followed in his father's footsteps, persecuting Christians and ordering the death of James, the brother of Jesus. But his power did not last. When tensions between the Jews and the Romans escalated, Annas the Younger was murdered by an angry mob during an uprising. His death was brutal, and his body was left desecrated in the streets of Jerusalem. a grim reflection of the violence he had once inflicted. As for the Roman leaders who had overseen Jesus' trial and execution, many of them saw their lives collapse in disgrace. Lucius Aelius Sejanus, an influential Roman official and ally of Pontius Pilate, fell from power in a dramatic purge by Emperor Tiberius. He was executed, his body thrown down the Gemonian stairs, where it was left to rot. His downfall signaled the beginning of a shift that would lead to the eventual ruin of those who had stood against Jesus. The deaths of these men reveal a pattern. Those who had sought to destroy Christ and his followers did not escape judgment. Whether through disease, execution, or violent uprisings, their ends came swiftly and harshly. They had used their positions of power to condemn the innocent, but in the end, they could not escape their own destruction. The fall of those who condemned and executed Jesus did not stop with the religious leaders or Roman officials. Even those who played supporting roles in his suffering met dark and tragic ends. Many who had stood by, watching as he was mocked and crucified, would later find themselves trapped in a web of destruction, unable to escape the consequences of their actions. One of the most infamous figures of that time was Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor who reigned during the crucifixion of Jesus. Though he did not personally order Jesus' death, it was under his rule that Pontius Pilate acted. Tiberius was known for his cruelty, paranoia, and indulgent lifestyle. As he aged, he became increasingly withdrawn and suspicious of those around him. His reign ended in disgrace when he was reportedly smothered to death by his own guards in 37 AD, after his deteriorating health and erratic behavior made him a liability to Rome. Some accounts suggest that he had grown delusional and tormented in his final days, a fitting end for a ruler under whose watch the innocent had been sentenced to death. Another tragic fate awaited Gaius Caligula, the emperor who succeeded Tiberius. It was during Caligula's rule that Pontius Pilate was recalled to Rome, likely to face judgment for his failures in Judea. Pilate's disgrace and possible suicide were just a small part of the chaos that followed. Caligula, known for his excesses and cruelty, declared himself a god and persecuted those who refused to worship him. But his reign of terror was short-lived. He was assassinated by his own guards in 41 AD, stabbed repeatedly in a brutal coup. His death was celebrated by many, as even Rome could no longer tolerate his madness. Meanwhile, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD sealed the fate of many who had once stood against Jesus and his followers. The Jewish revolt led to a siege by the Romans, during which the city was burned to the ground and the temple was destroyed, just as Jesus had predicted. Matthew 24, 1-2. The suffering was unimaginable. Famine, disease, and massacres wiped out much of the population. The religious leaders who had once condemned Jesus were either killed, enslaved, or left in utter ruin. Their power, which they had used to manipulate and sentence an innocent man, crumbled before their eyes. Even some of the soldiers who had mocked Jesus at his crucifixion were swept up in the chaos. As the Roman Empire faced rebellion after rebellion, many who had participated in the crucifixion were sent to the front lines of brutal wars. Those who had once laughed at Jesus' suffering now screamed in agony on the battlefield, meeting their own deaths in violent and humiliating ways. As time passed, the consequences of Jesus' crucifixion continued to unfold. Those who had condemned, tortured, and executed him had already met violent and tragic ends. But what about the next generation? What happened to those who inherited their legacy of persecution, continuing their fight against Christ and his followers? History records that the fate of these men was just as terrifying. One of the most feared persecutors of early Christians was Saul of Tarsus, a man who hunted down the followers of Jesus, imprisoning and executing them. He believed he was serving God by destroying what he saw as a dangerous movement. but his life took an unimaginable turn. While on the road to Damascus, he was suddenly blinded by a vision of Jesus himself. The voice of Christ called out, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Acts 9:4. This event changed him forever. He became Paul the Apostle, one of the greatest defenders of Christianity. But his past could not be erased. He, too, would suffer. After years of spreading the gospel, he was arrested and ultimately beheaded in Rome under Emperor Nero. Another key figure in the attempt to erase Christianity was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, better known as Emperor Nero. He was notorious for his brutality, setting fire to Rome and blaming the Christians for it. He ordered mass executions, feeding believers to lions in arenas and burning them alive as torches in his gardens. But his reign of terror did not last. His own people turned against him, and in 68 AD he was forced to flee Rome. Hunted and abandoned, he took his own life, but not before uttering his infamous last words, "What an artist dies in me." Even the descendants of those who had condemned Jesus were not spared. The family of Caiaphas, the high priest who had orchestrated Jesus' trial, fell into disgrace. Within a few generations, they lost all political power, and their wealth was seized by the Romans. The luxurious tomb of Caiaphas was discovered centuries later. Its remains a silent testimony to a man who had once wielded great authority but had died with no lasting legacy. The Roman soldiers who had mocked Jesus and carried out his execution also faded into history. Many of them were sent to the furthest edges of the empire, where they died in obscure battles. Others lived long enough to witness the rise of Christianity, watching as the faith they tried to suppress spread across the empire. Some, like the centurion Longinus, repented and became followers of Christ, only to be executed for their new faith. The death of Jesus should have been the end of his movement. Instead, it became the catalyst for something unstoppable. The very people who sought to erase his name were erased from history, while his followers grew in number and influence. Kingdoms fell, rulers perished, but Christ's name remained. And so the final judgment was not against him, but against those who believed they could silence the voice of God. If this story impacted you, help us spread the message. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with others who love learning about the history of Jesus. Let's reach 1,000 subscribers together and bring these powerful stories to more people.